Why are guns so overpowered in anime? How can an S-class Jujutsu sorcerer lose to a 9mm handgun? And why is it so satisfying to see guns break power systems? You've heard the phrase, the more complex a power system, the funnier it is when someone pulls out a gun. But how true is that really? And why is it kind of a great test for comparing different anime? That's why in this video, I'm gonna list the best examples of guns in anime, discuss how they negate one of anime's core principles, and explain why even the best power systems can have one major flaw. And the best way to do that is by starting with one of anime's core principles, fairness. To be clear, I really should be saying battle series. Obviously, if someone pulls out a gun in Kaguya-sama, that's a completely different situation. And if you're watching Black Lagoon, well then nobody cares because everyone has a gun. But in battle series, fairness is a crucial element because it allows characters to get stronger as long as they train enough. It guarantees that any character can achieve their goals or win a fight if they put in the effort. And even if there's characters with crazy abilities, fairness dictates that there should at least be some checks and balances between the different kinds of powers. This is where the element of complexity comes in, because the more rules you add to a power system, the more limits you place on otherwise broken characters. It's for these reasons that guns consistently shake up every good power system. Everyone has one example of an episode where someone brings a gun to a Beyblade fight or a Yu-Gi-Oh duel, and suddenly shit gets real. And the reason guns are so shocking in these types of anime is because guns are fundamentally unfair. Battle series are traditionally built on rules and fairness, so when a gun is added to that equation, the question for readers becomes, does this gun break the power system? Or in other words, does having a gun make the abilities pointless? And a great example of how this plays out is Jujutsu Kaisen. Specifically, the scene where Toji assassinates Riko. In this case, Toji uses a gun because it doesn't have cursed energy, so he's able to sneak it into the barrier undetected. And since it doesn't have cursed energy, nobody senses him before he sneaks up on Riko. So in the moment, if you ask, does this break the power system? It kinda seems like it does. Jujutsu Kaisen sets up all of these details about cursed energy and domains and barriers, but anyone with a gun can just walk up and shoot you. But Toji only uses the gun for a few minutes before he has to switch back to his other weapons. And he's really the only character to use a gun in a world where everyone else uses swords or spells. So the gun doesn't break the power system, but the fact that this can happen does make the gun itself especially unfair in this kind of story where everyone depends so much on sorcery, which highlights exactly why guns are so unfair in battle series. Unlike most of the abilities, they don't require a lot of skill to use them. And considering how deadly they are, given how easy they are to use, they overpower all of the normal abilities and ruin the balance of the fights. So the more limits you add so that a power system is carefully balanced, the more shocking it is when some schmuck uses no skill and pulls out a gun. But this is only true with real guns. Because if you watch enough anime, you know that guns aren't always the same. For example, in Soul Eater, Kid is famous for using his guns, but in his case, the guns shoot a kind of energy blast rather than real bullets. In practice, this means that he needs more skill to use them, and they aren't as deadly unless he powers up. It's also worth mentioning that the power system in Soul Eater isn't that complex. There are a few rules, but for the most part, characters can kind of do whatever they want, and the checks and balances are minimal. So in that case, guns aren't shocking because they don't act as a counter to any major rules. Another good example of this is Full Metal Alchemist. It's easy to forget that there are tons of guns in this show, but that's only because most of the characters rely on alchemy. But while there are rules to alchemy, the actual interactions between abilities are basically pretty simple. There's plenty of room for nuance, but there's not a lot of restrictions. In practice, this means that someone like Hawkeye is deadly against most characters, but put her up against one of the homunculi and they usually counter her attacks. In this case, guns aren't unfair because they're common, they have counters, and the power system doesn't have that many restrictions. But this brings us to why guns are surprisingly important in anime, because I just explained how guns aren't unfair in Fullmetal Alchemist and Soul Eater, but the whole point of guns is that they're supposed to be unfair. So if you put guns in an anime that's supposed to be fair, and the guns aren't broken, wouldn't that imply the power system itself is broken? In some cases, maybe, but this is where we have to talk about the overlooked spectrum of fairness and complexity. Take Dragon Ball, for example. Guns are useless in that show because even when an Earthling gets strong enough, they can stop the bullets. This highlights the lack of complexity in the power system because there's no hard limit on how strong characters can get, and there aren't a lot of rules about the interactions between abilities. But that doesn't mean Dragon Ball is completely unfair. In fact, there's a few cases where characters have access to one-shot abilities that, while not as overpowered as guns, do have the capacity to take out otherwise overpowered characters. Mind you, Dragon Ball isn't perfectly fair, but this element of one-shot abilities still shows us how there's still some balance in the power system that can be exploited. But that doesn't mean the power system has a lot of restrictions. This is what I mean when I say fairness versus complexity. Fairness is just how balanced the power system is. You can have balance regardless of exactly how many rules there are, and complexity just means detail. You can add entire data books of details to a power system, but unless they actually serve as limits, they don't necessarily make a power system any more fair. So when comparing anime, it's useful to think of this like a graph. You can have a power system that's complex and unfair, complex and fair, simple and fair, or simple and unfair. Now, going back to our question of would a gun break the power system, this is really only true when a power system is complex and fair. And a great example of why this chart is useful to think about is actually One Piece. Because prior to Hockey, One Piece was kind of a mixed bag. It had plenty of details for the abilities, but there weren't a lot of rules besides Devil Fruit users being weak to water and sea stone. And while Logia users were pretty overpowered at the time, they had the same weaknesses as everyone else, so the system as a whole was still somewhat fair. So this was a case where you had a power system that was simple and fair, meaning guns weren't that shocking to the system. Now, after the introduction of hockey, they still don't break the system, but guns are more relevant when anyone can coat their bullets or even arrows using hockey. Notice how once we add more checks and balances, this moves One Piece closer to that one quadrant where guns are actually overpowered. It's not quite there yet, but it gets closer with more complexity. But I do have to mention that this quadrant system isn't perfect, and there's no clear cutoff for a power system being simple or complex. A great example of this that actually inspired this discussion is Gachi Akata, specifically the scene where Ryo pulls out a gun and starts shooting raiders. Just before she does, we watch how Zonka loses to Jabber in a fight that sets you up to believe that the untalented hard worker was going to win. But then Ryo shows up and shoots the winner of that fight. Mind you, there is plenty of detail in Gachi Akata's power system. We know how you gain abilities, the different types of abilities, and there's even some limits on the abilities. But the abilities do get pretty crazy, and unlike a series like JoJo or Hunter x Hunter, there really aren't that many checks and balances. At the same time, this power system is clearly more detailed than something like Dandadan's power system, and the fact that Ryo gains such a clearly unfair advantage against two enemies by using a plain old gun does tend to imply that the power system is carefully balanced. This is an example of how the fairness and complexity spectrum is still useful as a frame of reference, but it's not perfect, and it doesn't define every power system. It also doesn't account for a third element that guns exploit in anime, and that is innocence. Because fairness is by definition a fair principle, any story that uses it tends to have a more innocent tone or worldview. Like our quadrant system, it's not a binary thing, but allowing anyone to achieve their goals or get stronger kind of depends on at least some optimism. And that's exactly why guns are shocking in any story that is even remotely fair. Gachi Akata is a great example of this because prior to that scene, we just thought Rio was unhinged. But when you see how willing she is to break the rules and take out her enemies by any means, suddenly you see a much darker side to her that sets her apart from every other character. Another great example of this actually comes from Hunter x Hunter. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but there's a scene where some hunters are like, "Oh my god, we finally got away from the ants." And then an ant shoots them with a gun and unloads a whole magazine. This is, in my opinion, the best example of more complex equals more funny because Hunter x Hunter is infamous for having more rules than any other power system, and in this scene, that all gets thrown out the window when someone decides to pull out a gun. It not only shocks the power system, but the scene is written in a way where you don't even see the character until after they shoot the gun, so the initial shock of the bullet is that much more surprising. But probably my favorite example of guns being used in anime is Eden Zero. This one stands out because it doesn't even take place during a fight. This takes place after Shiki loses to the villain Draken Joe. Mind you, prior to this point, Eden Zero was fairly lighthearted like Mashima's other stories, and included familiar themes like the power of friendship. But then Draken Joe says F you to friendship and power systems, and executes the main character of the story with a handgun. This is still one of the most shocking moments in anime because it shattered any innocence in the story and completely reshaped the viewer's assumptions about who was safe. And this is why guns not only should be overpowered, but they kind of need to be because they're a great way to shock anime. They expose flaws in seemingly perfect power systems. They're a great test to determine just how fair a power system really is, and they also shatter assumptions about death in stories where characters seem invincible. And that is why guns in anime are shockingly overpowered.